What if Ferrothorn was in Gen 1 OU? Now, what you see in front of you is not a joke. There is Pin Missile on this set because Ferrothorn, oh my gosh, does not have any moves for Gen 1. Even if you gave it National Dex movesets, it still wouldn't have anything from RBY. It's actually insane. I'll go over that in a minute, but I don't want to start the video on such a weird note. So let's start off with the obvious. This is one of the best defensive Pokemon of all time. And this thing has insane defenses. In fact, honestly, what Ferrothorn is basically just Shuckle but done right. Because Shuckle also has super high defense and special defense. But it has that at the cost of basically no other stats in anything whatsoever. Ferrothorn here is a lot more balanced. The speed is still pretty terrible, even for RBY standards. The special attack is just kind of bad. But you, at the very least, have a real HP stat. And dare even say, a pretty good attack stat. Especially for Gen 1 OU, 94 is pretty good. And the typing is honestly kind of weird when you really think about it. You have Steel, one of the best, if not the best, defensive type, compared with Grass, which is tied with Bug for the most amount of weaknesses. Or not Bug, I think it's Rock. Doesn't really matter either way, because unlike something like, let's say, Rock and Steel, where you just completely ruin both of the Pokemon's defensive utility, which is a terrible defensive typing, somehow Grass Steel isn't like that. I think it has to do with the fact that, strangely, both types really complement each other. For example, one of the main benefits to the Grass type is that you resist ground. And one of the main weaknesses for Steel is, again, ground. So getting a Earthquake neutrality with 131 defense, that's already pretty good. You also have example like Grass being weak to flying, Steel resists that. You're also weak to ice, which Steel also resists. And while, yes, most of these are being changed to just neutralities, because of your super high defenses, it ends up working out for you. And for RBY, this would be an even bigger deal, because you're using DVs. So you're having max HP, max defense, and max special defense. In any other gen, this would be absolutely terrifying and disgusting to go up against. But luckily, for everything else in the format, Ferrothorn doesn't have leftovers or any other items that it can potentially use. And also, like we're going to go over in a little bit, it has no moves either. In fact, it's like what you see in front of you is what I think would be the best set for it. Explosion is pretty self-explanatory. Thunder Wave, I would say, is probably self-explanatory as well. This thing is incredibly bulky. It can and will find free turns just to go for paralysis. Rest is, I would say, also pretty standard. You don't have reliable recovery, so this is the best thing you can do. But thankfully for Ferrothorn here, no other Pokemon will be able to get as many free turns as this thing. Outside of maybe Chansey. But even then, I would say Chansey as a whole is way more susceptible to crits. Now, Pin Missile. Why Pin Missile? The reason for that, you'll see very clearly once we look at Ferrothorn here. Let's try looking for moves that are in Gen 1. So like Explosion, yeah, obviously. Leech Seed is just pretty bad for Gen 1 standards. I kinda, or not that I considered it, but I was wondering if its moveset would be so bad it would have to use Leech Seed. But to be honest, I don't think there's any situation where Leech Seed's bad enough to have to use it on your set. Because, for one, it just doesn't heal as much as it does in other gens. And in two, they can just switch out. So there's really no benefit to it. As we keep going, there's Substitute, but you don't have high enough HP to tank 2 Seismic Tosses. And finally, we have some actual moves here. Thunder, Thunderbolt, Toxic. Toxic is just as bad as Leech Seed in Gen 1, so don't bother with it. And with your pretty pitiful special attack, Thunderbolt isn't really worth it. And I don't think Thunder is much better. But if you were to use something else to do some sort of attack, I suppose you might as well go for Thunder. In Sword Stance, at first I was kind of excited for. But as you see here, like no Body Slam. Like, is there even Double Edge? Nope, no Double Edge. Only Hyper Beam. And sure, Hyper Beam is a good move, but if it's just Hyper Beam and Sword Stance, really not a lot to go over. Okay, I guess technically there's Strength. I do forget about Strength often. But even then, I don't really think Strength for Ferrothorn is the call. Because Pin Missile, as weird as it may sound, it has 2 missions here, or 2 goals, I guess you can say. The first is simply having a lot of power points. Ferrothorn is going to have to use other moves for setup or keeping itself alive, which is why we have Thunder Wave and Rest. And obviously you have to use Explosion on this thing. Like, why wouldn't you? So just like with Slowbro, since you're only going to have 1 move, you're going to have something that's going to need to hit a lot. And thankfully, that's where Pin Missile was there. You're going to be alive for a while. There's not a lot of things in the game that can kill you without Fire Blast. And if they're using Fire Blast, that's inadvertently creating a problem for themselves. So, it's weird, but you can last a long time with Pin Missile. And the thing with Ferrothorn is that either it can stall the Pokemon out in a very long, drawn-out death, or it just gets outstalled or just killed instantly with a fire move. So in other words, it's either completely dominating or gets dominated. There is no in-between. And if this thing dominates, that means that the opponent cannot kill you. So even though Pin Missile is like a weak move, you will survive long enough to whittle down the opponent. Yeah, it's that bad. The other thing about Pin Missile that's kind of good is that, as you would expect from a Steel type that's resisted to Normal and Psychic, you're actually pretty good against Psychic types. Again, you have a real attack stat. So, Ferrothorn can very easily stay in against things like Starmie or Alakazam, and especially Exeggutor, and just hit it for super effective damage. And while Zam has Seismic Toss, and Starmie has Blizzard exactly, Ferrothorn, like, if it hits 5 with Pin Missile, it can hurt pretty badly. And neither Zam or Starmie do enough damage to where they can always kind of rely on crits to save them. Just keep in mind, Ferrothorn's going to be paralyzing these things. And when they're paralyzed, inevitably, you will be getting free turns where they're not moving. So you feel very comfortable going for rest and just healing off anything they can do. In fact, I think the only Starmie set that can beat you is exactly Psychic and Blizzard. And they need to go for Psychics to get like 1 or 2 special drops first. And at that point, ignoring the fact that you're forcing Starmie to use a very specific set, way more importantly, you need special drops, and the Ferrothorn could do whatever it wants. Because here's the thing, even with a potential Sword Stance sweep with Strengthened Hyper Beam, which by the way, I still don't really like too much. In fact, by doing that, you're kind of losing your matchup against Gengar. And because of Pin Missile, as depressing as it may sound, it turns Gengar into a great matchup, which I really don't think is worth giving up. But still, it's not completely unviable. In fact, having the option to potentially be a Sword Stance sweeper is terrifying, but kind of cool. But even if you ignore that, and even if you ignore Ferrothorn stalling things like Tauros out, and trust me, we're going to get to that soon. But on top of everything else, you have Explosion. Any point in the game, you can just become a nuke. And that's the scary part. This thing can stall, but it can just as easily take out enemy Pokemon. So I was very conflicted when making the replays, because when it comes to the tier lists, this thing really is just all extremes. There's only exactly 2 Pokemon that I can maybe call could go either ways, but outside of that, it's either great or unwinnable. So you know what? Good on him, because I have never seen a Pokemon with such a limited moveset actually work. I recently just did a video on Dual Blade, and Dual Blade has a better typing in Steel Ghost, but because it only has Strength and Slash, or maybe not even Strength, it might just be Slash and Rock Slide exactly. The point is, despite its defensive typing, since the stats aren't equally distributed, and since it has no attacking moves to really go off of, it struggled terribly. And Ferrothorn debatably has a worse move pool, because it's Pin Missile! What gets worse than Pin Missile, other than, like, Constrict and Bubble? I never thought I'd see it at work, but you know what? I think that this just really shows just how strong Ferrothorn is as a defensive Pokemon. And I also think, to a lesser extent, also shows just how strong it is if everything has max stats. Because the DVs, I think, is a big reason as to why it does so well. Also, I'm not sure any of you have commented yet, but for those of you who are being upset with the pronunciation, this is the one and only time in the video I'll call it Ferrothorn. I'm pretty sure Ferrothorn is technically the correct way to say it, but even if it isn't, I kind of think it's more fun to say. But, that's about it when it comes to the pre-analysis. There was surprisingly a lot to say, despite just how weird it is. But let's get onto the replays. I worded that very strangely, but whatever, let's just get onto it. And while we watch this very long replay of Tauros versus Ferrothorn, there is one thing I do want to say right here. Yes, teching in Fire Blast, sad as it may sound, is extremely optimal. But you know what? Here's the thing. And this is coming from someone who really likes Fire Blast Tauros. I honestly think next to Explosion and Hyper Beam, Fire Blast is probably like my 3rd favorite move in RBY. And in general, it's just a major guilty pleasure for me. But it has its downsides for very obvious reasons. And if you're using Fire Blast on Tauros, having to force Tauros and maybe Snorlax to go for fire coverage, that in of itself should just explain and show just how much of a threat Ferrothorn really is. And having Fire Blast, the opponent can very easily take advantage of that. Because, well, for one, it just means that other Pokemon like Starmie do way better. In fact, Starmie and Ferrothorn are just terrifying together. Heck, Starmie, Ferrothorn, and Chansey, are you kidding me? That is a terrifying defensive core. Yeah, it's like... And don't get me wrong, Fire Blast is still good. And even without Ferrothorn in the format, there's still some merits to use it, but... the more common Fire Blast is, the more common it is to just play around it. And if Tauros is giving up something like Earthquake or Blizzard, yeah, it's just hard to... really hard to, you know, just kind of deal with other threats. And that's the other thing about Ferrothorn at the end of the day. Now, I'm going to say it's already doing way better than I would have expected it would have in these 1v1 replays. But the thing that's most terrifying is just the fact that it is just so good at helping its teammates. Because, like, again, like, let's say, like, you try to go for a Fire Blast. This thing is really good at pivoting and maybe switching to a Chansey or a Starmie or Alakazam. And that's what I originally thought this was going to be at the end of the day. I thought, okay, it's going to have a bad move pool, but maybe it can still do good by just being a pivot. And it is absolutely a fantastic pivot. In fact, I think it's hands down the best pivot if it were to be an RBY. But who needs that when in just 33 turns you can 1v1 Tauros with Pin Missile? What are we even talking about, people? Now, here's the exact opposite. I'm gonna give you a big spoiler alert. Recover might be annoying, but manageable. But if you're a Pokemon with Rest, yeah, Ferrothorn is just cooked. And for Snorlax here, with how bulky it is, Pin Missile is doing nothing, and you're definitely not stalling it out. Like, there's no way it's happening. Maybe Sword Stance and Strength would be better. More often than not, I think you're just being forced to go for Explosion. And it's basically the exact same thing here with Chansey. Although, the Explosion is more effective since, in general, Explosion is just more dangerous on Chansey because of just how abysmally slow your... Or not slow, small your defensive stat is. I do gotta say though, even in these worst case scenarios, Explosion, still pretty nice. But even if we ignore that, Ferrothorn is still having a very easy time going for Thunder Waves. In fact, in some ways, I think Ferrothorn has an easier time going for Thunder Wave than, like, even Starmie, Zam, or Jolteon. And the main reason I say that is because Ferrothorn is already at 20 base speed, which is even slower than Snorlax and Slowbro. So more than any other Pokemon I've ever covered, Ferrothorn truly could not care less about paralysis. So, unlike Jolteon or Zam, which, while it's going to happen anyways in most games, does have a lot to lose from getting paralyzed, what's the worst that Ferrothorn has to deal with? If anything, it's going to enjoy not having to worry about freeze. Speaking of Alakazam, let's see how it does, alright? So, Seismic Toss technically is doing decent damage, but I think the issue here is, one, Ferrothorn can keep spamming Rest, and eventually, Zam will be fully paralyzed. But along with that, Pin Missile, if it gets lucky, kinda forces Zam to go for recovers every now and then, which does give Ferrothorn very valuable breathing room, especially since it forces Zam to go back for paralysis, which gives Ferrothorn a free chance to go for Pin Missile. And while it's only 85 accurate, you're going to survive if you manage to miss. And if you get, like, only 2, not a big deal, because Zam is not immediately threatening to you. The only threat to you is bad RNG with paralysis. And since you're both paralyzed, you're both equally as likely to deal with that. So here's Zam being taken out. And I don't think this is a very uncommon replay. If I had to guess, most are going to be like that, unless one side is super unlucky. But sometimes that doesn't matter. At first I thought, maybe this isn't too bad, since at the very least you resist Clamp. But just FYI, Ferrothorn does not wear Mega Drain or Razor Leaf, so... yeah, resisting Clamp truly does nothing. You're just demolished. Probably the worst matchup we have out of all of them. And we're following that up with the best one by far. Like, I guess there's Sweet Powder, but even with Sweet Powder, the only thing you're scared of is Special Drops, which, probably fine. And you'll see here, for example, like, Psychic is really not doing a whole lot. And I guess for this replay, you don't really get to see it. But who cares? Because between a Special Drop in one Psychic and a Critical Explosion, yeah, Explosion, definitely doing more damage. And Ferrothorn can tank that. Granted, it's like almost dead, but still, I think that's impressive. Next up, we have Gengar. Now, if for some reason you want to use Sword Stance and Strength and Hyper Beam, Gengar completely walls you. But I do truly think that's going to be the minority. Most of the time, you're using Ferrothorn for defensive purposes. And for that, paralysis alone already makes this Gengar super unviable. But on top of that, it's going to take a while, but you can chip down Gengar with Pin Missile. And this is a best case scenario for Gengar. What if you're only using Psychic and Thunderbolt? Nothing. Nothing happens, because Ferrothorn resists both of them. And even if Gengar gets special drops, it doesn't have Stab, so how many special drops will it take for Ferrothorn to take it seriously? It doesn't really matter, because on the first turn, Gengar's getting paralyzed. And when Gengar's paralyzed, that's it, really. Now let's just put this on hyper fast. How many turns do you think it's going to take before this thing goes out? Or before Gengar just says screw and goes for explosion? I want to hurry up. There's Gengar being fully paralyzed. And yeah, I guess we can also mention that when Ferrothorn does get 5 Pin Missiles, regardless of the Pokemon, it actually is kind of decent damage, I would say. At least in my opinion. Although I'm not sure what you would classify as decent damage. Well, here's Jolteon versus Ferrothorn. Probably the most interesting out of all of them. Because on paper, with the grass typing, you would probably think Jolteon just kind of gets walled, just like Gengar. But technically, both Double Kick and Pin Missile are doing around the same amount of damage. Although I will say, for these, or for this replay, I was kind of misplaying. And that's because I was mostly going for a Thunderbolt. When in reality, not only is Double Kick showing the super effective, text, which is always satisfying, but way more importantly, Double Kick has more power points than Pin Missile. 32 to 48. Which, by the way, kind of crazy that we need to even go over that in the first place. There's actually a relevant Pokemon that has more power points than Pin Missile. Are you kidding me? But on top of that, Jolteon is also a rest user. So that means that Jolteon can't be stalled out. Any Pokemon with rest, regardless of how tanky it is gonna beat Ferrothorn. Because Pin Missile does not kill fast enough. Now that's kind of embarrassing now, isn't it? And even in this replay, again, this one I was misplaying. Because I was using Thunderbolt when I should have just been going for Double Kick. It's not like it's in Gen 5 with abilities. There's no Iron Thorns. There's no Rocky Helmet. So really, there's no reason not to go for Double Kick. And with Double Kick and Rest, Jolteon wins this, I think, quite readily every single time. The only exception is Ferrothorn going for Explosion. But let's be real. If you're going for Explosion on a Jolteon, you lost the exchange. Big time. And to be honest, you don't even need it. Because there's plenty of other Pokemon that can stomp even harder. In fact, outside of maybe Cloyster, there's one Pokemon that stomps even harder than any of the Pokemon with Rest. Actually, now that I think about it, I think I will say it's even a bigger stomp than with Cloyster. And that's because Cloyster, at the bare minimum, kinda cares if it gets paralyzed. And obviously both Blizzard and Clamp can miss. And also Explosion just hits pretty hard. So there's 5. That was 37 turns, by the way. 37 turns. Oh boy. Next up, we have Jinx. For the tier list, I put this and could go either way. Although I think bad is probably more realistic. Granted, Blizzard only has 8 power points, so you might be able to stall it out. But at the same time, it's one of the few crits in the game, Stab Wizard, one of the few things that Ferrothorn truly has to fear. So with the crit, it can 2 a KO, but I don't know how often it's going to happen. I do think paralysis and potentially getting some good pin missiles could also maybe do some work. Here's the Pokemon I was alluding to. Probably the only thing that stomps even harder than Cloyster or any rest user. Because you don't care about Pin Missile. And you know what? As you saw there, Explosion, practically nothing. Practically nothing. Next up we have Swellbro. And despite being weak to Pin Missile, and despite resisting Surf, it's just not doing enough damage. It does barely nothing. And a big part of that is because Swellbro has high defense. So Swellbro is free to set up to its heart's content. And Ferrothorn might be able to explode, but that's like the best thing you can do. On the very least, as you see there, even with max special, you still do not even 2 a KO Ferrothorn. Which kind of just shows us how tanky it is, if you ask me. That's something at least. You might be able to take out Swellbro with Explosion. But now we have Starmie. And this is a Starmie with the best case scenario. It is Blizzard Psychic, which I don't even know how good that set is in general. I'll tell you this though. It might be the best thing to use with Ferrothorn around. Because Bolt Beam, or I guess Blizz Bolt, you might get lucky with Freeze. But most likely, Ferrothorn just stalls out Blizzard. And by the way, even while frozen, that's still kind of helping its teammates out. Because not only does that mean that something like Starmie doesn't have to worry about being frozen itself, but even while completely frozen, it is still a great Pokemon for pivoting. As a reminder, when I first thought of this Pokemon, I thought it was going to have terrible moves, but it could still, at the worst case scenario, be used for pivoting. I was wrong, and hopefully these replays can show you just how extreme this thing is. Because sometimes it's completely walling the best Pokemon in the game. Like, seriously, can we talk about that? Tauros and Starmie are fantastic, but they look like jokes compared to Ferrothorn. Meanwhile, Jolteon just stalls it out? This is a weird timeline. And you know what? Here's the scary part. I think the scariest part isn't even the Ferrothorn being an RBY. I think it's more so the implication of how much of a monster would this thing be in other gens. Now, I'm not super knowledgeable on GSC, but I'm willing to bet that this would easily be top 5, if not top 3, in Gold, Silver, and Crystal Gen 2 OU. And I'm sure this thing would be a monster in Generation 3 as well. And let's not even get started on Generation 4 with Stealth Rocks. Oh my gosh. The only gen where I'm not sure how it would do is, ironically, Gen 9. But even in Gen 9, I'm sure Ferrothorn would do great with Terastallization. It's just a Pokemon that's really hard to power creep. It's just that good of a defensive behemoth. And we're going to keep going with this replay. But I think at this point we can just probably put in Hyper Fast. I'll give you a spoiler and say that because of special drops and with Blizzard, I kind of just went for Explosion just to get the replay over with. But to be honest, as you see here, like, the Starmie lost all of its Blizzard power points and only has 7 more Psychics. So even if Starmie somehow wins with this very specific set, Ferrothorn did its job. It stalled out Starmie, and it had a horrible time. And last but not least, we have Zapdos. And it's weird, but this is the only true could go either way that Ferrothorn has, outside of maybe Jinx or being optimistic. And it's weird because Zapdos has good defense and it resists Pin Missile, but it doesn't have recovery. So it's not the most likely thing in the world, but it is possible that you can rest off and maybe kill it with Pin Missile after a very long time. Granted, looking back at the footage, it's definitely way more in Zapdos' favor. But also, you have Explosion, so that's a good trump card if nothing else succeeds. And if it's Sword Stance with Strength and Hyper Beam, it just kind of wins against Zapdos. But for the sake of looking visually appealing, because these probably make more sense in bad matchup, but I think it just looks way better just having like this, where you have 6 Pokemon in Great, 6 in Unwinnable. I didn't intend for it to be this way, by the way, at least when it comes to the ones in Great and Unwinnable. That's just kind of how it went. But yeah, here we go. This is the most divisive tier list I have ever made, if I had to ask. And like I said before, it's either fantastic or terrible. There is no in between. And despite having so many things that are unwinnable, I don't think it matters. I am convinced that Ferrothorn is OU. And you know what? I am never gonna add this thing into a Generation Jumble. Because this thing is a monster, and no one would have fun playing with it. By the way, I host tournaments and formats based off the what if videos that I make. So if you're interested, please join the Discord server. I would love to have you. And you don't have to worry, there won't be any Ferrothorns. So, yeah, that's a positive. What do you think? Do you think Ferrothorn would make it in OU? Or do you think there's just a little too many bad matchups to not be viable? Let me know in the comments below. But until next time, this is Groundback, and I look forward to hearing from you.